Okay, hello and welcome to our presentation today that we're titling The Climate and Environmental Crisis, a Primer for Psychotherapists. We're happy to have you with us today. We are from Climate Psychology Alliance North America, and this introductory description is really serving as an overview that we as climate aware therapists are trying to figure out and understand what we can do and all that we are facing in this climate crisis. So I'm Wendy Greenspun. I am a board member and steering committee member of Climate Psychology North America.
Thank you, Wendy. And I'm Elizabeth Allured. I'm one of the co-presidents of Climate Psychology Alliance North America, and we're both clinical psychologists.
Okay. And we'll be mostly doing a PowerPoint and have some moments for you to reflect on certain things that we will be discussing. So I will get back into the slideshow now.
So the first question anyone might have who's doing therapy is, why do psychotherapists even need to know about these two crises and how they impact our work? Well, I found these two studies, the first done by Yale about what Americans are feeling about the climate crisis. And 66% of Americans are actually somewhat worried or very worried about climate change, 2/3 of the population here. And there are some stronger feelings than that. 41% feel outraged about the crisis, 40% feel helpless. And I'll skip down to the last one, which I feel is maybe more crucial. 11% feel it is too late to do anything about it. So if you just think about how that feeling might sit in anybody who's coming for therapy, I think it's certainly in there among top issues that they might need to talk about. There was a study of adolescents and young adults aged 16 to 23 about their reactions to government inaction about the climate crisis. And this study covered individuals in 10 different countries around the world, including the US, the UK, India, the Philippines. And they were all having a lot of strong feelings about this crisis. 80% of the international sample felt, quote, betrayed, unquote, and almost half, 48%, reported themselves experiencing negative impacts of the crisis on various aspects of their functioning, eating, sleeping, school, relationships, etc. And over half felt anxious, powerless, guilty, angry. And as you can guess, individuals who were living in areas that were more prone to impacts of climate crisis, low-lying areas, cities that were had displacements from climate extreme weather events, those individuals were having higher levels of distress. And again, this bottom statistic, I think, is very crucial. 56% of these young adults felt humanity is doomed. So if you can imagine sitting with that feeling and how that might impact your life and your feelings about the future, there are real reasons why people need to talk about this. So we're going to present various aspects of this crisis and how it's impacting individuals, ourselves, people we're seeing in our clinics and offices. First, we're going to start by understanding the broader context of this crisis, including the embedded sociocultural factors, systemic racism, colonialism, and how these factors impact on mental health. Secondly, we're going to talk some about how we can process our own reactions to this crisis and our defenses so that we don't shy away from this with our clients, or we don't expect to project our own feelings onto them. Thirdly, we're going to talk about how climate distress might show up in our offices, in what ways people try to talk about it, or ways they try to avoid talking about it. And then we're going to talk about various traumatic responses to actual climate disruption and extreme weather events, and what's called pre-traumatic stress or anticipated traumas in the future. We're also going to talk about ways to bring in the more than human world in our clinical conversations as a lived experience that we're all having all the time. And we're going to finally talk about the need to build resilience as we're all facing these ongoing and intensifying extreme weather effects and various other environmental crises.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
So we have a larger context in which the environmental crisis is embedded. And there are many different ways that the different crises overlap. And I'm going to go into those right in the next slide. So because we have these larger issues, we cannot use our old ways of thinking to deal with this kind of a problem. Just like we can't sort of expect to roll on with business as usual and just add a carbon tax to solve the climate crisis, we cannot expect that our business as usual therapy can adequately address this problem, because it concerns problems that haven't been talked about in therapy before, such as the possibility of human extinction, the relationship with the more than human. What's now being talked about is what is the risk of societal collapse if these problems are not adequately addressed, et cetera. So fortunately and unfortunately, as Sally Weintraub would say, the climate bubble is bursting. That level of defensiveness that has carried us along, helping us to avoid what's going on in the climate crisis, sort of like the financial crisis and housing crisis. These bubbles have existed within the culture to keep us blind to systemic problems. And now, because of so many extreme weather events and a lot of news about these, it's becoming more difficult to avoid these overlapping problems. So when many of us think about the climate crisis, we often think about levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this is indeed one of the crises going on right now. We have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than at any time in human history. And this is leading to, as we know, heating of our planet and disruption of the normal cycles of climate and extreme weather events as the atmosphere is holding more CO2 like a blanket and slowing down normal progression of storms. Storms are intensifying and lasting longer. So this is related to a crisis on the ground, which is deforestation. And this is occurring due to our greater use of agriculture and pushing into forested areas, and the profiting of deforestation through the sale of lumber. And this leads to less carbon storage because our trees are like sinks pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere and bringing it nicely into the ground. As the trees are cut down, we have higher surface temperatures and desertification of the soil, because the soil is no longer holding the water that the tree roots had held and kept the soil more fertile. So this leads into our third crisis, freshwater depletion, as currently 40% of people around the world are experiencing water scarcity, unable to find clean water to drink, and enough water to water their crops. So this leads to crop failures and also to the mass migrations that we've seen both in Europe and in the southern parts of the United States, as people try to leave areas that are no longer productive farmland. So along with this, we have global soil degradation because of the types of agriculture that are being used, instead of more traditional methods, which took less from the soil. And this is leading to an overuse of the minerals in the soil. And we also have the problem of overgrazing animals on the soil. leading to erosion and more desertification. So you can begin to see these are all looping together. And the fifth crisis has to do with ocean acidification. Our oceans have actually been helping us greatly in the greenhouse gas crisis by absorbing almost a third of the CO2 that we're adding to the atmosphere. However, this leads the ocean to be more acidic, and it causes diseases in many marine animals, some of which we use for food, and some of which actually produce oxygen for our breathing. So sounds like it couldn't be worse, but we've got to throw in the sixth mass extinction, which is an ongoing loss of plant and animal life, which has accelerated tremendously in the last 100 years. And one of the things that's most troubling about this is our insect pollinators are dying. And we need our insect pollinators, our bees and other insects to pollinate our food crops. And this could lead to more food scarcity in the future.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Boy, that's a lot to take in. And I'm just thinking, those of you who are listening to this, just sit with what your reactions are. Pay attention if you want to jot down any feelings that come up. That there's a lot when we hear the bigger picture and we really think in terms of larger systems and what the impacts are, the intersecting impacts, as Elizabeth has just described. And so now I want to go into other intersecting impacts, the multiple layers of intersecting socio-political harms that are really embedded in and amplify and connect with, intersect with the climate and environmental emergency. That's what we're calling CEE. We know that there are similar roots in the climate crisis with colonialism, systemic racism, patriarchy. All of these things come from the roots of things like an attitude of domination over others, over the land, thinking we as humans can control things, that we don't have to face limits. The idea of exploitation or extraction, that we can use other beings, whether human beings or other parts of the natural world for our own needs and benefit. And then this idea of othering, this split between my group and another group, or humans as a group and the more than human world. So again, you can sort of see these parallel roots which make these crises very embedded. And then there's the inequity of the impacts of what's going on. We know that those who contribute the least to this whole set of 6 intersecting crises and the warming of the world, those are the people that suffer the most, but they are really contributing the least. So those in the global south are suffering much more than those of us in the global north. And so it's a really inequitable distribution of impacts. Low-income communities are often located, let's say, near toxic waste dumps or in flood zones. And so again, they have the least contribution in terms of their carbon footprint, but they are suffering the most. So there's a saying, and I don't know who to attribute this to. I haven't been able to find the source, but I think it's a great concept. We will be in the same storm, but in different boats. So we can also see that the climate and environmental crisis becomes an amplifier, a multiplier of existing kinds of problems. So it's a threat multiplier. Again, as I've already mentioned, it amplifies existing inequities. So communities that have few resources to begin with. If we think of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, those communities that were given very few resources to begin with suffer from an extreme weather event and don't have the resources and are not given the resources and infrastructure to be able to deal with the crisis as it unfolds. So in this way, the climate crisis multiplies the threat. It's also a trauma multiplier. So we know that individuals and communities who have already been experiencing trauma of different kinds, whether it's transgenerational trauma, feeling marginalized in society, experiencing poverty, systemic racism, those traumatic impacts that are already being suffered just get amplified as the climate crisis unfolds. So we really see how inequality is just embedded in what we experience. So it seems really important as we're talking about all this that we as psychotherapists need to enlarge our view of how we think about the problems of the people who are coming to see us and that we're working with. And we think about sort of crossing a threshold in our clinical work and enlarging our views of what the sources of difficulty are, and also maybe our views of what kinds of help can we offer. Maybe we need to step out of the confines of the traditional work that we do. And I'll just use this quote from Meyer and Land, which I think is helpful. A threshold concept can be considered as akin to a portal, opening up a new and previously inaccessible way of thinking about something. It represents a transformed way of understanding. And we hope that this presentation today, if you're not yet engaged in this work, can help you to cross a threshold of sorts.
Thank you, Wendy. It's a good reminder about the complexity of the work we need to do within ourselves to help with this crisis. So I wanted to introduce a more encompassing kind of mental health model than we've been used to dealing with, or maybe than you were trained with. Although it starts in the same places, we have in there the smallest embedded circle of the intrapsychic model of the mind. This was the original idea of the therapist sitting in a chair and the client sitting in a chair, and the therapist helping the client understand their own mind. And without much awareness of the interplay between the two individuals and how important that therapeutic relationship was for the healing of the individual who was coming for help. And then the model expanded to include interpersonal influence, that not only what other people in the client's life do, but our own work with the person and our own influence on the person has a great impact on their thinking, their feeling, and how much they can heal from difficult experiences or whatever they've come in to work with. The model was expanded to include a cultural component and a socio-political component more recently, so that we understand that if you take two people, they're not going to be experiencing the same event if those two people are from one culture as if they're from another culture. So we need to understand, of course, cultural context in our work. Now, what we're seeing as the need to expand this into is that there is an ecosystem that each of us is embedded in also, that is having continual impacts on us, whether it's the daylight length, or whether it's an extreme weather event, or whether it's what we see when we walk outside in the environment around us, that the ecosystem is constantly impacting us and we're having reactions to it. So our model needs to include some kind of inquiry about that when it becomes apparent that that's somehow a part of a clinical need that someone is bringing in.
Thank you. So as we've been sitting with what we've talked about so far, and we think about the emotional responses, both for ourselves as clinicians, as Elizabeth was referring to, that we are part of that larger system and ecosystem with our clients, we need to think about what are these emotions that are coming up. And I think there's been a lot recently in the news, in the literature of thinking and understanding climate anxiety, climate grief. I like to use the broader term of climate distress because it encompasses the range of different emotions. And I think these emotions exist on a continuum often, and also maybe fluctuate in terms of the amount of distress or which feelings are in the foreground the most at any given time. So you can see emotions along the fear continuum: fear, anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, even to the point of extreme terror, panic. Then there's the emotion of sadness, depression, all the way to feeling hopeless and sort of bereft. There's grief, feelings of deep loss. We can also feel guilt, about being a part of this problem, that we haven't done enough, and even shame about our complicity, about the ways we've benefited from a lot of the parts of the world that have caused the problem, and yet we haven't been weighing as deeply what the impacts are and what the costs are. There is also a lot of frustration, anger, even rage. I think many of us feel that kind of anger, and we see that a lot in young people, especially, sort of being angry at older generations who did not take this problem seriously enough. We also can see a sense of kind of numbing or emotional shutdown. I've had some climate students say they even get sort of desensitized. It's kind of a turning, like I can't feel things anymore. So that can all be encompassed under the term climate distress. And we can also see, or sometimes instead of, we might see defenses against these difficult emotions, anywhere from, minimizing the problem, splitting, sort of putting the blame elsewhere, and not seeing one's own part in it, or not wanting to see the reality of it. Intellectualization, one of my favorite defenses, doing a lot of reading and understanding of it, but kind of moving away from the true emotional felt experience of this, and projecting, again, sort of the problem is somewhere else. It's that person's problem. It's that political party's problem, and not mine. And so we do need to defend against knowing at times. And then there's the more common, when we think about the climate crisis, people in denial or disavowal being knowing on one level and wanting to sort of push away the reality of it or the impact of it so that we can bear it, because it, as Sally Weintraub again has said, it protects our hearts when we can push away some of it. And then with a more traumatic sense of it, even a complete dissociation, moving away from those feelings. So, having just described the variety of kinds of feelings of distress that we might feel in the various forms it can take in defenses, it's really important that clinicians work with their own emotional reactions to the climate and environmental emergency, partly because we are embedded in this same problem as those people we are trying to help, our clients. So unlike with many issues that we deal with clinically, we can't just stand outside of what the client is feeling, because we are feeling it too. So it's a challenge. We've probably gone through that with this pandemic. That's been a glimpse of it. Maybe there have been a few other things, but often we can stand outside. And we also need to become aware of and process our own emotions so that we don't either become overly activated if our clients are sharing their distress, or that we sort of conversely could sort of defend against wanting to know and avoid talking, engaging, really trying to understand the depth of what some of our clients might be feeling. So it's really important that we as clinicians work with our own emotions.
Thank you, Wendy. Again, there's been a lot of material that we've shared that might have stirred up things for you, or reflections about your own reactions to these two crises, really 6 crises. And we'd like to have you take a minute now to just consider some of all of this that you've been experiencing, if you've been writing it down or just letting it sort of wash over you. And think about, what are the emotions that you've been having as this has been occurring? You might identify with a number of them that Wendy has just talked about previously, or something new might come up that you didn't expect. And also consider some of the ways that you might be trying not to feel any of this or not know a lot about what's going on right now. And we'd like you to take a minute to pause this video and sit with this for a little bit, both considering your feelings and considering maybe some of your defenses about this, which we all have. Wendy has her own, I have my own ways of trying not to think about this and trying to, look on the bright side sometimes rather than sitting with the full extent of it. But each of us has our own way of processing this. So take a minute if you'd like to pause the recording and then come back to us in a minute.
Okay, so we're coming back now, and if you didn't take a pause then, we hope that after the presentation you'll reflect on some of what came up for you, again with the importance of knowing your own feelings. And when we're talking about the climate and environmental crisis, or these 6 intersecting crises, as well as the embedded psychosocial crises, it's a lot. And often when we think about doing this work, the idea of trauma comes up. So, one definition of trauma is the psychological response to a deeply disturbing or distressing experience, which really overwhelms the capacity to adequately cope. And an idea that sort of helps in thinking about why the climate crisis can be so overwhelming or traumatic is Timothy Morton's concept of the hyperobject. And a hyperobjects are things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. We are embedded in it. We can't see the contours of it. We can't control it. So that can feel, again, it matches up with that idea of it's deeply disturbing and distressing and overwhelms our capacity to adequately cope. In talking about this, we thought about different kinds of trauma that we could consider when we are encountering people's reactions to what is going on that's related to the climate and environmental crisis. So the first idea comes from Lise Van Susteren, and other people have written about this, of pre-traumatic stress. So pre-traumatic stress would be those who have not yet directly experienced climate-related disruption, extreme weather events, but are very aware of what is unfolding. It's more anticipatory distress, anxiety, grief, a sense of guilt. And I think recently a lot of us have been thinking this maybe is even a misnomer. There's no longer a pre in terms of our traumatic stress, because we have evidence that's just happening so much, at least all over North America, and probably has been going on much longer in other parts of the world, that we are aware of the changes in our environment, in what's happening in the weather. And so pre may not even exist. We do know, though, that a prior history of any kind of trauma, individual trauma, transgenerational, or communal trauma, may increase the likelihood of, or a sensitivity to, what's going on in terms of climate and environment. So I can think of, for example, people that I've worked with who had a family trauma of some kind, find themselves just much more aware of when the environment doesn't feel safe, when they feel that those in power. Let's say they had a parent who had been abusive, so they don't trust those who they should be able to rely on to create a sense of security and safety. Then when they encounter awareness of what's unfolding in terms of environmental degradation and climate disruption, it echoes with, it amplifies some of those feelings that they've already had, where they can't trust that those in charge will keep them safe. So you can see how this can be a magnifier, again, that sort of amplifier of previous trauma. Those in communities who have already been marginalized, Black and brown communities who have already been experiencing stress, it will amplify that. And we do want to emphasize that a traumatic response to the climate emergency is not just a displacement of these previous traumas in an individual's life. We all will process what's going on through the lens of who we are in our own history, but it doesn't mean it's a displacement of what's going on or even a pathological response. Instead, we see it as a reasonable reaction to what's unfolding, and maybe even a helpful reaction, because it allows us to take seriously what's unfolding and then find ways to cope and manage and take action. We're also aware that pre-traumatic stress may really reflect a position of privilege, and often white privilege, because at least as a white individual in North America who hasn't experienced direct threats, I can speak for myself on my own life, this may be seen as, oh, this is an existential threat. But again, communities of color have been living with existential threat for centuries. So we have to be aware of this pre-traumatic stress idea being perhaps part of being in a position of having not had stress of this kind before.
So another kind of stress we're going to be seeing in our offices or our clinics are what we would call post-traumatic stress or acute traumatic stress following this increase of extreme weather events. And maybe for some of our clients, this is the first time they're really living through what used to be called natural disasters, and the disruptions and the not only the physical disruptions maybe to their homes, to their communities, but the emotional disruptions that this can cause as they are beginning to feel less safe in the world can be really stressful and very important to talk about. And, individuals can have very disrupted stress reactions. They can have trouble sleeping. It can sort of overtake their normal concerns as, if someone came into the therapy for some other reason, and then suddenly they're in an extreme weather event, this can dominate the work that they need to do to process what does this mean that these events are happening now? What does this mean about their future? What does this mean about the impact they'd like to have in their career life, for example? I found that adolescents do a lot of work on this when they're faced with an extreme weather event, because it really takes them out of their typical expectations into a true feeling of uncertainty, which, as Wendy has said, might be the first time they have really faced an existential threat. And it can lead to some good and serious thinking about what's important in life. So these kind of extreme weather events can pull out the need for kind of a disaster response within communities. And some communities are set up to handle this, and others have been calling more on mental health providers to help them with the growing numbers of individuals who are feeling traumatized and now maybe even feeling angry about these events occurring, which are, partly due to our own impact on the climate system and the government inaction about that. So there is more trauma treatment that is needed for individuals who are experiencing these things. And that's why I think it's important to learn as much as we can about typical reactions and how to help our clients with them.
Thank you. And I'll just add, in this acute traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress, really a lot of the work ends up being helping to calm the nervous system, helping to find resources, really working on a crisis basis. And so that's really helpful. We also know about pervasive or ongoing trauma, also referred to as continuous traumatic stress. That's a phrase from Eagle and Kaminer. And this is for those who have been experiencing continual traumatic climate disruption, but again, other forms of environmental harms, toxic stressors of different kinds, various embedded psychosocial traumas, systemic injustices. So, those who live in more polluted areas, again, low income communities that are situated near factories where there is ongoing pollutant particles in the air, are suffering higher levels of asthma and other health disruptions, and then have inadequate resources for managing that. If we think of some of the political disruptions that have been happening, often there's climate involved in that. So even thinking about Afghanistan or Syria, where there are droughts, where the ways that the government has responded or not responded to farming needs or taking care of food security for their people, all these things amplify, again, what ends up leading to climate migration and disruption and becoming refugees. So again, we see the embedded psychosocial harm. So this is just an ongoing form of trauma, and the effects can be cumulative and pervasive rather than a discrete event that we can sort of address in the moment as it's happening. This is much more pervasive and requires a lot more work on, again, sort of providing resources, helping communities to elevate some of their own natural leaders that know the community and work in communities. And mental health professionals can sometimes be consultants in that process of working with what are the natural resilience builders within communities and for individuals. So just another form of trauma that we know is occurring.
So that's been a lot of information, again, that we've given you about different kinds of trauma and traumatic topics that might come up in therapy situations. And we're hoping that, again, that you can take a little bit of time here to just reflect on what it would be like for you to have a client walk into your office, and maybe someone already has, but you really haven't taken the time to think it through in terms of how you sort of cobbled together a response. But really think about what would be difficult as a client would start to bring up their climate distress as they sit with you in a session. And, do this in as much detail or as little as you like, but we just want you to start thinking about how this might occur, whether it would be around an extreme weather event or someone who's, facing a difficult experience embedded in a systemic trauma, and think about what might be your response or how might it be difficult for you to think about this. So again, we hope that you could pause the video and, think and maybe write a few things down that you could think about later after we're done.
Thank you.
Okay, so welcome back. I hope you had some good thoughts there to consider for later. We're going to talk now about how climate distress is not showing up. We've had this problem for many years now, and it's been in the news for a number of years. More recently, it's getting more coverage, but the question is, how is this not showing up in our offices, and what is causing it to not show up. I do believe that many clinicians feel that talking about the climate crisis is not very relevant to their work as a clinician. And I would say this number might be shrinking as time goes on, and as clinicians, as we ourselves are experiencing more extreme weather events and even more climate distress ourselves, we begin to see how this is a very important topic to bring up, because where else do people have to talk about it? However, if you're having trouble thinking about why it's relevant, you might think about larger issues that clients could be bringing in that they could perceive as more important and that could actually be more important. I gave a workshop for a group of school psychologists about traumatic aspects of the environmental crisis and how they might show up in the school guidance office. And a number of the school psychologists did say, yeah, that this does make a lot of sense, and they'll start looking for it. But then there were a few who said, this isn't relevant to my work as a clinician. And that was primarily because they were saying that kids and adolescents that were coming into their offices were talking about problems like the violence in their neighborhood, or a dysfunctional family situation, or a learning problem, which was making life miserable for them in school. And they really didn't, the clinician really didn't see this problem as relevant to working with students or adolescents. And I do think that, you know, there are moments when we can see an end to this topic, which we'll talk about later. And there are other moments when we just need to focus on whatever's being brought by the client in the room. So there's another reason why I think this is not showing up, and how. And I think that's primarily because the clinician feels overwhelmed by the topic themselves. And to give an example of this, I presented a paper on the topic of climate psychology at a large conference about 4 years ago. And I had a co-presenter who also presented a paper on this topic. And it was the only presentation on this topic in this very large conference, where there must have been 100 presentations. And in the ending keynote address, there was a time for questions, and my co-presenter raised her hand and asked the conference presenters up at the front why they felt there were not more presentations on the climate crisis at this conference. And the conference organizer up there paused and thought for a minute, and then said, I think we're all just feeling overwhelmed about that. And that was a very honest answer. And we can all relate to that answer. And there are times when I feel too overwhelmed to think about this. But I think it's good to at least know when we're feeling that overwhelmed, so that we can be open to other people's interest and need to talk about this at times when they're sitting with us.
Thank you. So a little more on how do we understand the silence. Again, it can just feel too big, and that hyper object is there. We're embedded in the problem and we don't know what to do about it. So that might be a reason that clients are not bringing this up. They often can say that they didn't think it was a relevant topic for therapy, which is generally focused more on their personal life. And so I have certainly heard clients, when I do ask about it, say, oh, I didn't think I could talk about this. So that's important to understand. And then, as Elizabeth was sort of making reference to, therapists sometimes don't think it's a relevant topic for therapy. And so they don't inquire or look for evidence of it. And along with that, it can be a feeling for the therapist. Again, maybe it's a displacement. This is not the real thing. It's a stand-in for something more personal. If they're talking about harms to Mother Earth, maybe it's really about how they feel about their mother. But we need to realize it is a very real experience that is going on, that we are all impacted by. And so it is, of course, relevant for being explored and understood and worked with in our clinical setting. Therapists also often feel worried that they're the one that's concerned and they don't want to impose their own agenda on their clients. And I think that's a very understandable experience and response. And so we do want to take care with how we raise it. But again, when there are things going on that a client is not focusing on, but that may be relevant, it's important that we feel some freedom to inquire. And so we want to talk about, so that silent elephant in the room, there are ways that we can try to embrace it, as the photograph shows. We do know as clinicians, there are precedents for this, that there are many, many topics that if we as the clinician don't bring them up, the client might not feel that it's safe to bring it up, that we would feel comfortable discussing it. So studies that were done on inquiring about sexual abuse, that often a client wouldn't bring it up unless the therapist raised it as a question. Do you have a history? Or talking about race, talking about racism. If we don't bring it up and show that we have interest in this, that we are capable of talking about this topic, again, the client may not feel the permission. And certainly if you find a way to inquire about it, it doesn't mean you have to keep pushing it as something that must be important if the client is saying it's not, but just bringing up the topic allows some level of awareness and reality that you are open to it. So we often think about looking for openings in what is being presented. So it's not going to just come out of the blue, but something as simple as a client walks into the office, at least if you're seeing people in person, we're recording this at a time when most of us are doing a lot of remote work, but it might not even be in your office, but they comment on, wow, it's so unusually warm in December. So I would use that as an opening to say, yeah, what does that bring up anything for you? Does that make you concerned or worried? Or does that make you think about the climate change? And I've been amazed to see how many people from a small opening like that have an outpouring of reactions. I had a client who says, I think about climate change every day. I am so worried about it. I'd seen this person for years and they had never mentioned this until I had asked about it. You can ask, when someone says they can't sleep at night, well, what's on your mind? What keeps you up at night? What is it that you're thinking about? And I can think of couples I've worked with when they're talking about should they have children or not. Well, is climate a part of that? Is that in the mix of what they're worried about? Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to share, if you have an example of just an opening.
I do think that when people bring up extreme weather events, especially ones they're embedded in, that's a really excellent time to broaden the conversation, of course. Also, I've found that high school students in their science classes are getting very disturbed about what they're learning there. And there's often no follow-up about, well, how does all this new information make you feel? The science teachers really aren't trained to be group process leaders in, giving people very bad news about their future. So I often sort of get the wave of that information comes into my office in terms of, boy, I can't believe what I learned in science class today. And they didn't really know it was okay to talk about it with me. That was sort of a school problem, but it's certainly more than a school problem. It's a problem that they're living with, and it's going to really impact a lot of decisions they make. And that there's even anger about that they can share with me as someone who knows how to help them process their anger, that maybe the science teacher was not trained in, how do you deal with a bunch of angry adolescents. I think that's where our skills that we've really honed over the years can really be used as a great service to people who are feeling very distressed about things, especially when they're given a lot of information all at once, like in a science class. You might imagine the amount of information and the detail, which can be so disturbing for people to learn about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about this additional relationship we have, and if we think of our model, our model of mental health as including the ecosystem, because we're being impacted all the time. But much of the time, we aren't really aware or conscious of that whole world around us that is really nurturing us all the time, or most of the time, whether it's the air we breathe, the food we're eating, the beauty that we see in the world that uplifts our mood. So how do we bring conversations about this into our offices when it's really typically not really discussed? We can ask our clients about, do they have pets? Do they have houseplants? What are they attached to that's in the more than human world? And what do these things give to their lives? For many people, pets, houseplants, walks in nature are very sustaining and very regulating of their emotions. People often talk about their pets as, they'll know that their pets will always love them, when other people let them down. So we can start to think of these as kind of supportive elements in people's lives that they might want to think about, do they want to strengthen their relationships with some of these attachments as we face more difficult times with the climate crisis. We also, as Wendy was saying, be curious enough to ask about, what their feelings are about some of the events that are occurring in the more than human world, whether it's what they're hearing on the weather, what they're seeing in their backyard, the lack of birds that used to be there. And, we're impacted all the time about things. And I do believe we don't feel this is a topic that most people want to hear about. It's kind of taboo because people are afraid they're going to stir up another person's anxiety about the climate crisis. And so it's kind of backburnered and it simmers back there until someone like a therapist is curious enough about it to help them feel what's going on inside of them and think about it in a new way. So to summarize, we can sort of ask about how an individual might use this more than human environment as a way to regulate their emotional self. I know that during the pandemic, Wendy and I both would go for walks every morning. And during all the distress of living through the difficulties in New York that was in the early parts of the pandemic, we each had our walk where we would walk to natural environments, or even if we were walking on city streets or town roads, we would notice the birds, the trees, and these things would help regulate the distress of the pandemic at that time. And I don't think we should underestimate how much this can be helping our clients, and some of them are already doing this, and we can sort of support that as they're facing more of these kind of societal disruptions, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's an extreme weather event. That more than human can often be a kind of an anchor when we think of it that way.
I just realized that this slide says their use of the more than human in self-regulation. And as I've become more aware of being interrelated with the more than human, maybe we don't want to use it. We want to include and relate to the more than human in our self-regulation. So it's just an interesting kind of growing awareness of that that I was reflecting on as you were sharing so well about how to be inclusive in this way.
Mm.
So wanting to move into, okay, how do we help build emotional resilience in the face of climate distress? And when we've thought about this, we kind of came up with at least 5 different arenas or areas that we might consider: calming, emotional engagement, emotional regulation, the idea of purposing, which was a term that comes from Bob Doppelt's work, uh, forms of replenishment, replenishing our emotional resources, and then the concept of re-earthing. So I'm going to go into, we'll go into each of these areas. So calming of the nervous system, I think we all know about the sympathetic nervous system, that when we are under stress or a sense of threat, we have that fight, flight, or freeze response. And so as clinicians, we often help people with self-regulation and distress tolerance strategies to help calm. And so especially when there's a more acute trauma, but even in anticipatory trauma, sources of distress, we can teach and work with our clients around various strategies such as mindfulness or meditation practices, deep breathing to engage the parasympathetic nervous system and bring down that reactive response. Exercise is a great source of calming on a regular basis, releasing stress and tension, listening to music, looking at pictures of aspects or people or settings that bring joy, pleasure, calming. All of those things can help with this parasympathetic calming that we want to help with. And then, the basis of our therapy often is emotional engagement, but in a regulated way. So we do want to make room in our clinical work when people are feeling climate distress to process those emotions, to not be afraid to ask about and really spend time with what's going on, what do they feel in their body, how are these emotions impacting them, providing a safe container that can make it feel okay to have these feelings, to know that they can be held, tolerated, worked with. And we know the importance of emotions. So grief, guilt, a sense of mourning can actually represent the love and the care that we feel about what's going on and the harms that have been taking place, and they can facilitate the desire to repair. So we see the importance of moving through the emotions to kind of get to the other side, to take actions that can be more helpful. We also know that when we become unsettled or dysregulated or disrupted psychologically, that's often an impetus to grow in new ways and to stretch ourselves. So again, it's really important to be able to have emotions. And as we think about this, I often think of Dan Siegel's concept of the working in the window of tolerance, which he talks about in terms of trauma work. So finding that capacity to talk about emotions, process the emotions without getting overly distressed, because if someone's overly distressed, they sort of shut down or can't really work with the emotions. So that's when we bring in some of those calming strategies, back off if needed, distract if needed, and then go back to whatever level of emotional engagement and processing the person can work with. So I think that's our being a good clinician and how we work with emotions in general, but just good ideas to keep in mind. Then this idea of purposing, Bob Doppelt wrote a book on transformational resilience and talks a lot about, with climate distress especially, we need to find ways to have something important and meaningful and a sense of purpose that can come out of the distress and the upset that might be there. So finding purpose and meaning, focusing in on important values, like what values. I've had a lot of clients who have really been struggling with climate distress who end up getting to a point of saying, Who is the person I want to be in the midst of this unfolding crisis? What kinds of meaningful action can a person take? And that doesn't mean a dysregulated action that's sort of frantic and they'll get burnt out, but a meaningful action that feels purposeful. Sometimes people want to talk about hope. Where can I find a sense of hope? For others, it's not about hope. It might be more about courage. I know Mary Anais Hegler talks about, especially for BIPOC folks who have been experiencing so much distress and trauma, that maybe courage comes first, then action, and maybe from action comes some hope. So in whatever form, some way to kind of move forward in spite of the distress, or even because of the distress, might be important. Building a sense of optimism, and that is not a Pollyanna-ish idea, but more from positive psychology, when we think of optimism as focusing on those aspects of what's going on that you can control, rather than dwelling in all the things that we don't have control over. So that can be helpful. A sense of gratitude sometimes can help with that. Like, what do you still feel gratitude for in the midst of what's going on? And then often what's useful is building a sense of community and solidarity. I know Elizabeth and I, from early on in our work, and we've been working together, teaching and learning about the climate and environmental crisis, we built a sense of community with each other, with regular weekly Zoom calls to talk about our feelings, to talk about what we want to do, to try to find meaning, to grapple with these feelings. So we've become sort of climate buddies or climate analysts for each other. And we formed other groups where we've done that. Climate Psychology Alliance North America has become that kind of community for me and for other clinicians who are joining together to try to find what we can do within this unfolding crisis. And I also think about replenishment. So much when I've talked with climate students and climate activists, they will talk about just like, I feel guilty if I want to go to a party or stop and have fun, but it is essential in doing any kind of work in this area, or even in just facing the distress, that we need to take care of ourselves. So like a healthy ecosystem, we have to replenish the resources, not just deplete our emotional resources. So good self-care, eating well, getting exercise, getting enough sleep, finding room for creative endeavors, because creativity sort of reminds us of what's beautiful and good in the world, and draws from some part of ourself that is not just in despair, but that can transform despair and fear and anger into maybe something that carries meaning. And of course, cultivating sources of joy, pleasure, being with loved ones. I really encourage people still have fun. I think those of us in the pandemic, we most of us have had to try to find those sources of joy and pleasure, but it's essential when we're going through something difficult, especially an ongoing situation of extreme fear.
Thank you, Wendy. And I'm glad you kind of ended that with enjoying loved ones, because our attachment relationships are really one aspect of our lives that are going to help us get through this. And I've heard it said that sometimes when people get very into activism, they place the activism ahead of their attachment relationship, so they don't have time for their spouse or their family or whatever, their good friends. And I think we really need to rethink this, because without the support of our attachment relationships, our human attachments, we're going to have more difficulty with this. And along with this idea of attachment, I'm bringing this idea of re-earthing into the conversation. As clinicians, we think some about the idea of unearthing trauma that, buried within many people, there are minor or major traumas, and it's our job to help bring those to light. And that's true, but also we have to think about how can a relationship with the earth help bring us into a more solid relationship with ourselves? Now, it's simply kind of stating the obvious that we're all dependent on this entire ecosystem around us. But if we can become more aware as we're walking through our day that we are in this kind of a holding relationship with the ecosystem, that much like the family is a holding relationship for the child, the ecosystem is a kind of a holding relationship for us all. And we can experience that, and it can bring us joy, it can bring us solidity. And, you know, when we think of ecosystems, I also think of the emotional ecosystem, which includes feelings like awe. And individuals are often feeling the sense of awe when they're deep into a kind of a transforming relationship with the sunset, or the birth of a child, or animals that they have not noticed before. And it can bring awe, and we need a sense of awe to balance out some of the very difficult feelings that we're having as we go through this crisis. And just remembering to work on our ties to the more than human, and realize that they can really help us, whether it's our tie to our neighborhood, or I've talked with people who feel a real sense of attachment to their houseplants. You know, maybe they don't have a yard, but they take great care for their houseplants, and they watch their houseplants grow and change. And this is kind of another form of stability in their lives, and a source of joy. One way we can use this concept is also to think of transforming what might be degraded landscapes in our neighborhoods to make them landscapes that people want to be in and enjoy. And as we know, urban landscapes that are more populated are less liable to have crime going on in them. So problems can be kind of approached at various levels that are all interconnected. We are, move towards our earth relationships, we strengthen those relationships, and we transform our landscapes at the same time. And Bob Dalpelt had a concept of ecological circles of support, of identifying what in our lives, in our landscapes and in our ecologies gives us a source of support, and really thinking about that when we're feeling less stable, and helping our clients think about that as they're going through traumatic events or traumatic feelings about what's going on. That this is the relationship with the earth has both positive impacts and negative impacts, just like any relationship we have with people in our lives. And it's about becoming more aware of all of that as a system that we're living in.
So thank you. So as we're coming to the end of this presentation, we just wanted to share this poem from Mary Oliver. And I'll read the quote. "I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world."
Thank you, Wendy. Certainly a lot. If the ideas we've shared have been interesting to you and you would like to learn more, or maybe get to know more about individuals who might want to share with you in learning about all of this, please feel free to join us at Climate Psychology Alliance North America. Look at our website if you want to find more to learn about. And there are many, many organizations that are involved in teaching, training, writing about this. And also, if you want to volunteer, we certainly have lots of room for volunteers, whether you're interested in helping youth and adolescents, whether you're interested in clinical training, and whether you're interested in interfacing with the media. If you want to volunteer, please reach out, and I'm sure we'll find a place for you. And if you are interested in learning about our Climate Aware Therapist directory and what's involved in joining up, there's a area to find on our website of how to become a climate aware therapist. And we hope that you'll be interested in this and gain more skills so that you can help individuals as they're thinking about these problems and coming into clinics and offices and wanting to have a welcoming space to think over this and work together and come to some greater understanding of how to work with this in their lives. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, and we hope this was helpful. Have a great day.
We'll hope to see you at CPA NA.